Hi, I'm Flavius. You won't be able to tell by my very British name and my very British accent that I'm not from the UK. I'm actually from Romania. So I drove yesterday a 7-legged journey, 15 hours to get here. But actually I'm quite happy. It's a lovely place and thank you for having me. Before I get into the topic of my talk, though, I thought I would build up a bit on what Alan was talking about earlier, and I would share in 2 minutes our case study. I work for a company called Mozaic, and we're actually an IT consultancy, mainly in Agile, and we are organized internally in an Agile fashion. That is, we have 2-week sprints. We have a Trello board where we keep track of all our projects and all the small increments that we try to deliver every couple of weeks. And those may be moving forward with the organization of a conference or a public event, or maybe developing some IP stuff, that kind of stuff. We have retrospectives every 2 weeks. We have daily stand-ups every other day. Not much of a daily, but you get the point. Okay, so this talk will be about me basically trying to save you some money. I will try to take the principles of the lean startup and see how they fit within the product development and the product design practices that we have. So this is me. I've been a web developer, and then I co-founded a startup in Romania, and my latest incarnation is that of a coach and trainer. This is what we're going to be talking about. I will try to explain the waste as I understand it and as I see it in product development. We're going to go quickly through the lean startup concepts and dive a bit deeper into the techniques, the examples. I'll share a couple of examples of how to apply those techniques, and then to wrap things up, we'll discuss a bit about the principles behind it. So waste. This is a product I was the product owner of, and this is a screen of a feature. It was developed about 5 or 6 years ago. And while I was preparing this talk, I did the numbers. So it cost us about 40,000 euros to implement. Now remember, this is Romania, the wages are a lot lower, and so on and so forth. But when I added up all the licenses we sold for that feature, this is what I got. So talk about wasting money, right? And it got me thinking, maybe we're the only ones doing things wrong. And now that I get a chance as a consultant to see a lot more companies, I see a lot of these types of examples. So this is an example from one company that I've been working with. This is not their actual interface, I just ripped it off the internet, but it was kind of the same thing. They were having, they weren't happy with some numbers in their application, and they said, well, you know what, we feel that people don't understand how to use it. So we'll just add this tutorial kind of screen, and it will say, click here to do that, and click there to do that, and so on. And it took them 2 months to do it, about 250 man days to implement. And at the end, their usage dropped by 30%. Because obviously it wasn't that intuitive and it kept popping up at the inappropriate moments and so on. And if you look at the industry research, I think some of you have seen this, it's quite popular. We use it a lot in the Agile world to justify Agile. It's a study done about 12 years ago. And just take a quick look at it and tell me what you see. It's basically how many of the features we are putting inside our products are actually being used. 18%. 18%. At least think about the 80-20 rule. And so my claim, my thesis is that most businesses waste money because they invest time and effort developing products and services that nobody uses, really. So, how could you be throwing money out the window? Well, maybe you're building something that nobody wants. Google Wave, anybody? Do you remember? Yeah. actually, Google had a lot of products like, what was the other one? Google Buzz. You remember Google Buzz? Okay, you could be instead building more than your client needs. I did the research on this, and there was a study in 2009 or 10, and they said, you know what, Microsoft Office has 1,200 features. 1,200 features. And I don't know if you've ever used ICQ. Winamp, probably, most of you have. Those were two products that added so many features that they ended up having the light version because nobody was making sense of the other one, right? And then you could be throwing money out the window via the opportunity cost. Think about Nokia. Think about what it cost them to stick with Symbian instead of switching to Android, for instance. That was a huge mistake. Think about Flickr, the one's go-to place for photo sharing. It became irrelevant once Yahoo purchased them and forced them to make all sorts of enterprise-y integration stuff. And now the go-to solution for photo sharing is Facebook. The biggest photo sharing website on the internet. And Instagram is on the rise. Yeah. All right, let's go sideways, right? The remote headband, or the iPod, that one is actually for your kids. So while they are sitting on the potty, they can play with the educational app of the iPad. Right? The one at the bottom, probably my wife would purchase it, but I don't know that there's a bigger market than that. Okay, do you want more? What about the hair hat? And my personal favorite, the wheel-made steering wheel desk. Because what could go wrong with having your laptop on while driving, right? So, all right, why does this happen? I'm saying it happens because we assume too much. We assume that we understand our users. We assume that they are like us. We assume that, you know, just because we want to integrate with System X, naturally they would want to integrate with System X as well, and so on. So, for the remainder of this talk, I will try to solve this issue. But before I do that, we're at the conference. What's a conference? A place where people confer and talk and discuss. So, I want to ask you one thing. For 2 minutes, turn to somebody to your left or to your right and try to share a story, an example of when you built something and then eventually it turned out not to be useful. Or when you assumed something and it turned out to be the complete opposite. Okay? And then we'll come back. 2 minutes. Now, before we move forward, quick show of hands, how many of you are using or have used some of the lean startup principles, practices? Okay. What about design thinking? All right, good. So, basically, the lean startup solution to the problem I mentioned before is to build things incrementally. Start off from a set of assumptions that you identify up front. What are we assuming about the market? What are we assuming about the user? What are we assuming about the need? And then run a bunch of experiments and iterate on your solution and on the problem, perhaps. So this is the scientific method, right? You get curious about something, you put forward a hypothesis, you run some experiments, you gather the data, and the data might validate or invalidate your hypothesis. So this man, Eric Ries, took those concepts and he wrote this book called The Lean Startup. And in it, he tries to apply the scientific principle to building a startup. And he basically said, well, you've got some ideas, so you build a little bit of product. You put it into usage, and you measure the numbers. Are people actually using that product or not? And based on that, you get the data, you learn, and you iterate more and more and more. But I've always had a bit of a challenge with this concept because they haven't given me enough to answer these questions. How could I be building? What should I be measuring? What should I be learning? And another body of knowledge called design thinking gave me some answers. Design thinking is a structured approach to innovation. It's been popularized by a company called Agile, and they are doing industrial design. For instance, they came up with the thick-ended toothbrush, the grip. So, and their process goes something like this. First off, you start off by understanding the user. Who is my user? You empathize with that person. You run interviews and so on. The next phase is try to understand their problem. As engineers, we have a lot of skills in the solution space, but we don't spend enough time in the problem space. And this is what the design thinking community strongly advocates. Once you get a grip of the problem, you generate a lot of options, the ideation phase. Next, you start prototyping, you put it in front of the live users, you test it, and then refine your thinking. So the Lean Startup and the design thinking have a lot in common. What I really enjoy about the design thinking movement is the emphasis on understanding the user and the emphasis on generating multiple options. So basically, I took the two together, and what it gave me was this annotated build, measure, learn cycle. And actually starting from the fact that in design thinking you start off by empathizing, I would say it's rather learn, build, measure. You want to first learn who your customer is, what the problem is. Next, you move on generating multiple ideas for the solution and selecting the first candidate for a step forward. And then you want to measure. Was it useful? Is it in production? Are people using it? Have I chosen the right alternative if I have 2 or 3 or 4 that I don't know which one is the best? So I know up to now it's a bit vague and unclear. Now let's go deeper into the actual techniques. And I will take the 3 phases, the learn, build, measure, and I will present some concrete techniques for each. So in the learn phase, again, we're trying to understand the customer and the problem. And here, the interviews and the shadowing, do you know what I mean by shadowing? Okay. Storytelling, getting the customer to describe their pains and their problems. Or you, inside a team, going to your teammates and describing what you have seen and soliciting their input. Those are really valuable. The innovation games, it's a book and there are a series of serious games that you could play with your customers. For instance, show and tell, right? What would that look like? You get the customer and they bring you the 20-column Excel sheet that they spend 3 hours a day working in. And they describe every single cell and how they are using it, so that you get more insight. Empathy map. This is something really, really useful, I think, and popular in the design thinking community. Because it forces you to prove that you really have understood the customer. What do they think and feel? What do they see in their environment? What do they hear from their co-workers? What have you noticed them say and do? What are their pains and what are they trying to gain? Okay. So let's take a quick example. Suppose we are developing an application for conference attendees and we're trying to empathize with the conference attendee. What would we put up here? What might our prototypical customer think during the conference?
Which talk should I go to?
Which talk should I go to? For me, that's one of the biggest challenges. Am I in the right room? I'm thinking probably half of you are thinking this right now. What do they hear? Well, they go outside and the friend says, dude, I was in the other room and it was so great because I learned about TDD and what have you. And so on. You go in every section and you try to fill it up. And thus, you empathize with the client and you understand more about their problem before jumping to the solution. These are some tools you can place on your client-facing website. And one of them is basically a chat app that you can embed. The other one can be triggered. Like if you have somebody sitting on a page for more than 30 seconds, there's a probability that they're either away or that they don't understand something. So you could guide them through a radio button type form. The lean canvas is also useful in the learn phase. This is a tool that's useful for actually all three phases, but I'm only presenting it here. This basically documents your key assumptions as you are starting to build something. It's used, again, in the concept of a startup, but you could use it as well in the context of a product. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Which are the customer segments? Coming back to my conference app. You might be thinking to segment, right? You've got the first-time conference attendee who has different needs than the conference speaker, who has different needs than the professional conference goer, for instance. So all these tools are meant to help you understand the client and understand their needs. Next, you move on to the build phase. Here, we are very good as engineers. How many of you have an engineering background? Maybe half. So, in the build phase, what you want to do, other than build, is identify your hypothesis and really think about, do I have a business case for this new feature I'm adding? Or is it just something that the VP of something really, really wants? And we've got the Agile techniques of having a prioritized backlog, building incrementally. These are techniques that are really useful in the build phase. But here are some others. You're starting off to build a new feature in your product. Before you do that, before you start actually writing the first line of code, sit down with your coworkers and try to identify what are our main hypotheses. What are we assuming will happen? When we give this capability, we think we'll get some outcome, and this will be the way we measure it. Now, let me put this in more concrete terms with an example. So, Barry O'Reilly from ThoughtWorks, he's also a consultant, told me this example. They were working with a company that helps people book travels, basically. And they had an international presence. And at one point, they started wondering, well, you know, there's this whole mobile movement. People start having more and more mobile devices. This was a couple of years ago, should we have a mobile website, or website optimized for mobile, because it was just for the desktop and you had to pinch and zoom and all of that. And they said, yeah, it's probably a good idea, but they had presence in multiple countries with slightly localized versions in each country. So they thought, well, which one should we go with first? Should we do it for all of them? So they came up with this hypothesis. They said, if we'll have a mobile homepage, we'll see different usage based on the country. And we'll know we are right. So we will know that not all countries have the same type of usage when we see at least 10% difference in the usage between the countries. So they did just this. They didn't do the entire website. They just created the homepage to be mobile, optimized for mobile. The rest was still, you had to pinch and zoom. But then, what they understood was that, for instance, France, who was the first, the number one country in mobile usage, had 30 or 40% more traffic than the others on the mobile devices. So at that point, it became obviously where they should focus their development efforts to make it work perfectly in France first, because that's where most of our mobile usage is. The MVP, the minimum viable product, the minimum marketable feature. This is the staple of the lean startup. And I'll exemplify it using Facebook. So this is Facebook circa September last year. And it's got a bunch of features. But if you were to describe this one, it would be viewing somebody else's photo. That's the main feature you are seeing. And if you have this lean startup concept, you're not building all of this at once. You start asking yourself, well, do I really need to see what device that person used to post? Was it mobile or was it an app? Do I really need to add tags? I was with my wife and had beer. Do I really need to show where it was? Do I really, and so on and so forth. You can narrow it down to, well, you know, the minimum marketable feature in Facebook is being able to see a photo, like it, and comment on it. That's like 90% of the job done. And you can go even a step further. There's this concept of the Concierge Mvp, which is basically, let's put up a front end that looks good, but we're going to manually do all the back-end processes. So we won't be writing the code. We'll be writing automated emails by hand. And we'll go into the database and crunch the numbers by hand and put the data in. So, food on the table. This is a startup, one of the first startups to do this. They had this idea of creating a website for stay-at-home parents to help them cook dinner, basically. And they would provide them with recipes and recommendations based on what they cooked in the past. And they would tell them, you know, the ingredients you need for this recipe are, by the way, at that supermarket, which is 5 kilometers away, and what have you. But they didn't want to build it until they were sure that they actually there was a need for it. So what they did was, for the first few months, they would go and sit in supermarkets. And they would try to get people to sign up to their service. It wasn't automated at the time. They would follow around mothers who came with their children. They saw what they were purchasing. They would follow them home, with their consent, of course. And see how they were cooking and what types of need they had. And then at the end of the day, they would manually write an email saying, oh, this is the service of food on the table. Here's what you might want to cook tomorrow. And they wanted to get people to sign up to their service for $10 a month. Which, again, was completely manual. And they started adding code only when they convinced the first 5 people to buy that subscription. So this is the Concierge Mvp. The leanest piece of software you could build. All right, what about the measure phase? this is where the data and the analytics shows up. So Ash Maurya wrote a book called Running Lean, which is like the second most popular book after the Lean Startup by Eric Ries. And what he did was he said, you know what, I don't really want to write the book and not sell it. So here's an idea. I will pretend I'm writing the book. I will put this landing page. I will put the contents down here. And if 50 people subscribe to my newsletter to be informed when the book is launched, I know I have a market, and I know I want to write the book. Okay, here's another one. This is a tool I'm using for remote collaboration called Web Whiteboard. So you share a link with 2 or 3 of your mates, and you connect remotely, and you write on the whiteboard, and you can have like a real-time digital whiteboard. And at one point, I realized that they had the button up here, send this board as an attachment to an email, something like that. And I said, okay, so that's cool, I can send it to everybody. And when I clicked it, this pop-up came up. I don't know if you can see it, but it basically says, well, you caught us, we don't have that feature yet, but would you pay for it? Yes, no, maybe. And if we're not implementing it, would you still be using the tool? So again, a type of gathering the data that you need. Paper prototyping. Let's bring the customer over. Let's draw some interfaces on pieces of paper, and let's show it to them. Try to simulate an interaction and see if and what is the response. Analytics. There are multiple tools, KISS metrics, there was one called user cycle, now it's mixed panel. You basically plug various codes into your code that log data into these tools. And then you start measuring. How many people show up at my site? How many people register? How many people log in? How many people use a certain feature? Or you can go even more in depth, and you try to understand why a certain scenario that you're hypothesizing would be useful isn't working. You try to see where you are losing people. In a sense, I've got 100 people at step number 1, 80 people at step number 2, and then 5 people at step number 3. It means I need to reward something or make something more clear, or maybe I should split the screen into 2, I should merge 2 screens into 1, and so on. Okay, so in a nutshell, you'll have these slides available, and I encourage you, if you find it interesting, to come back, because there's a lot of information that you should follow up on if you think this is useful. Okay, so what about an example? This is a good example. I gave you an example of how I lost money for the company, and now I'm going to give you an example of how I won some money for the company. So we had this appliance, that a security appliance. That was what we were building, and you installed it at the edge of your network, and it filtered all type of hacking attempts and so on and so forth. And one of the features was it was blocking emails that had spam and viruses and phishing attempts and so on. But our customers at one point started asking us, well, how do I know you're not blocking the wrong thing? So we'd really want to get a daily digest of all the emails you had blocked, in case your algorithm had gone awry. So, okay, these are basically the steps we took. We had some interviews with them, and then we learned that, yeah, indeed, there is some need. We built it, but we did not want to build the full GUI version. So we built just a simple command line interface. And we went to 2 of our clients, and we said, okay, how does this look like? The more techie people. And they said, it's okay, but it needs some other improvements. These are the ones that you need to add. So we improved the command line interface, and then we released it as a beta. We said, guys, we don't have the graphical user interface, just go ahead and play with the command line interface. We contacted 5 other clients, and we said, do you want this? And they said, yeah, we want it. Well, do you need something else? And as always, they came up with, we need these 8 new actions to do for every mail. Block it, whitelist it, blacklist all the emails. It doesn't matter the terms actually. But they asked us for about 8 actions that we needed to add as functionalities for every email. And obviously the sales guys were like, you really need to put all the 8 actions because that will allow us to sell. And I was the product owner and I wouldn't want to add not even one of them. I would have wanted to do something else. But in the end, we agreed on building 4 of them. And we built the graphical user interface with the 4. We put it into the next release. And then we started tracking for these 5 clients and the other 2. We started looking into their logs, into the usage logs, to understand whether those features were useful. And we realized that they were doing something repeatedly. So we had to add one more feature that would allow them not to click on 100 things, but do it bulk for all of them. So we went back, we added that 5th action. Another release, we waited for feedback. Everybody was okay. So we didn't build anything else. We just tracked the license sales. We saw that it was profitable, and we were happy. Now, let me be more concrete. These were the 4 things that the people wanted. Release the email, delete it, whitelist the sender, and so on. These are the 4 that we dropped at the initial negotiation for the scope of that feature, and at the first release. And eventually, we realized that we needed to add the 5th back. Now, I did the numbers on this one. So, basically, by not developing the 3, we saved 860 euros. It might not seem like much. It isn't much, obviously. But think that this is the work of 3 people over the span of not even 2 weeks. Now, if you take those numbers, if you multiply them by 5 so that you match for the income between Romania and UK, for instance, and then you multiply it by the 20 or 50 people you have in your teams, and by 1 year, just think of how much money you could not be throwing out the window. Here's another example from an even more diverse area. So, as I was saying, I'm working for a consultancy, and we thought about developing a new training course. And we used the same principles to do it, so it's not software. Basically, we had a team retrospective, and we realized that we needed something for Scrum Masters that were in their 2nd or 3rd year on the job to get their skills to the next level. So we brainstormed a bit, but we didn't want to invest all the resources to develop a 2-day workshop and have nobody show up. So we wanted to do it incrementally. And the first step was, okay, we knew we wanted to add something about leadership, servant leadership in it. So I developed a 2-hour workshop, which I submitted at the conference. I went at that conference, I had 30 people come up, they said it was a good idea. They liked it. And it was a technical type conference. So even better. And okay, so there's a need. At the same time, we received a request from a client. Do you have something like advanced Scrum? We want to run a 1-day workshop. Okay, so at that point, we created just the structure for the 1-day workshop, not the content. And we created the lean canvas. We tried to put, so okay, who are the Scrum Masters, what are their problems? We tried to empathize a bit with them. What could be the value proposition we can bring them? We went back to this client, they accepted, but they told us that facilitation is important. It's a big deal, how you facilitate the Scrum meetings and so on. So, okay, we said, okay, let's add that in. That was something we learned. So, we built the content for a 1-day training, and then we said, all right, let's create the structure for a 2-day training. Again, not investing in it. We did just that. We went back to some of our clients. They said, okay, that sounds good. Where do I sign up? We created this. We added the 2 dates for October, but up to this point, I still don't have the content for the second day. So we're waiting for the registration, and some of them already came. But the moment where we have, when we have enough registrations, I will start working on it. So this is the second example. Now, I'm moving closer to my finish. Here are the principles you want to follow. So we dove in deeper onto the actual techniques, but what's really important is the mindset and the way you approach product development, I think. The first one is try not to get fixated on one solution. Do you know the story of the Russian spaceman?
Yeah.
So, for those of you that don't know it, it's more like a fable. It turned out to be wrong, but as a story. In the 60s, the Americans had a problem. They were sending people to space, and they couldn't use the pens to write in space because, well, no gravity. And pens work on gravity. And then they said, okay, we'll just hire a company, we'll pay them $500,000 to develop the pen that writes at zero gravity, that had a spring and so on. Whereas on the other side of the continent, the Russians just handed their astronauts pencils. So the whole point is not to get fixated on one solution, but generate multiple solutions, and then converge on the one that suits you best. Also, have you heard of the hiccup? The highest paid person in the room's opinion. Do you sometimes design products like that? Yeah. Well, you shouldn't, actually. You should base your decisions on validated learning from the market, from the clients. You should run your interviews. You should build your MVPs and see whether they are actually being used or not. Their assumption. Small joke. When I submitted my talk in April, March, I think it was, I was thinking, you know, September, beach, nice. I'll just take my bathing suit and I'll go and I'll take a swim. It will be so nice and sunny and all that. Well, not so much. What are the assumptions you are making about the product, about the market, about the way it will be used? This is another interesting heuristic. How much time would you say you are spending building new features over tweaking the ones that you've already built? Is it 50-50? Is it 80% new stuff? Well, it should be the other way around, actually. Because the first time we put something into a new product, by definition, it won't be the best solution, it's the poorest solution. Do we go back to revisit it? Or do we just run around hoping that the next one will be the one that brings in the buck? You should spend 80% of your time tweaking the existing features. And again, if you want to truly demonstrate that you've learned, you need to measure it. This is a bit the technical bit. Ideally, what you want to do to support all of this from a technical standpoint is to have a so-called continuous delivery pipeline, which is basically, I've got developers writing code, and they're pushing it to Git or Subversion or what have you. I've got the server, the Jenkins, that monitors it. I apologize if I'm getting a bit technical. It's the only slide of technical stuff. And this server automatically triggers a new version of the application, a new build, that gets tested at the unit test level, and the developer gets back feedback if it failed. Then automatically, the same server moves to the next phase where we run automated end-to-end tests, system tests. And all of these are run automatically. Automatically, it deploys to the next phase where we can do some manual user experience testing and acceptance testing and so on. And if all of these steps pass, inside this tool, the product owner, the product manager, has a button that says release it. They click the button and it goes live into the production environment. So this is the type of technical capability that is really useful when you are doing lean startup type of development, because it enables you to have multiple iterations. I unfortunately have got some clients that tell me when they need to release a new version, it takes them 2 weeks. Because you won't be able to run a lot of experiments if everything you put into production takes you 2 weeks to do. Okay, so this is the wrap up. You should always start by empathizing with your customer. Who are they? What do they need? Ideally, you would create an empathy map, or maybe personas or something you are more familiar with. You should try to identify your assumptions and document them with the lean canvas. The minimum marketable features are minimum. So what's the smallest thing you can put out first? Measure so that you learn, continue refining the 80-20. And if it proves not to be bringing in money, have the courage even to remove a feature from the product. So these are some books if you want to dive in more on topic. We'll have some questions, and then I will ask you to do one last thing.
Oh, cool. I love the hippo, having been a hippo, and some would say I still am, so I'll have to think back on that one. That's good. Any questions from the room? Flavius?
Yeah. Is there any issues in terms of managing kind of relationships with customers? Take your example about the 2-day course. So if you'd worked out that as a measure you needed, I don't know, 50 organisations to sign up to make that viable, and but you've only got 30, for example, so you decide, I'm not going to progress. You've potentially got 30 people there that are not going to be best pleased that you've told them that you're doing a 2-day course, but now I guess you're going to go back and tell them you're not doing it now.
So, in this particular example, we are doing the course even if I have like 10 people. So,
but as a general principle,
yeah, it does happen. It's the cost of validating the fact that there is no actual need for it.
Yeah.
I mean, even if that pop-up that I showed you earlier, we don't have this feature, annoys, I don't know, 100 people, you still get the information that at least 100 people would value that. You implement it, and there's a high likelihood that 1,000 more people will come next. So it's like a sacrifice type of...
It's just being aware of how you manage that should you get into that situation,
yeah.
I guess, isn't it? Having thought that through, that if I do get in that position, this is how I'm going to deal with it, I guess. Or that it's not an issue because it's just random people off the web and there's millions of them. Yeah.
It's true. Now, in our case, again, we've held some trainings even with 4 or 6 people because we are committed to providing that type of service. And you need to take that on a case-by-case level.
Okay, good question. Another one? Yes?
How do you suggest ways of giving the BA or the hippo a kick up the arse to actually take this approach of thinking? I've been in God knows how many companies and worked on projects where people have put ideas forwards, you sit down, you develop it all out, and then you find out exactly as you say, no one's using the feature. But I completely agree with everything you've got in here, but to get people to buy into it and to take that approach, any suggestions?
I think one good way is if you could introduce a tool such as the Lean Canvas in your company. And you say, let's make sure we've done all our analysis correctly. Let's try to fill this up. So that's one, because at that point the hippo will realize that maybe they don't have the data. So that's one. Another one is if you do have analytics in place, try to bring those and show the numbers. Yet another one would be, if they keep pushing, create an even smaller minimum marketable feature and say, okay, we won't do all of that, we'll just do it incrementally, and let's just put the first piece into production, attach some analytics to it, and see whether you are right or not. So it's all about installing a feedback loop in your organizations from the product decisions to the money. I ask this a lot of product managers, and I say, all right, so you come up, you ask for features. How do you know whether the features that you've asked for really bring you money? And it's sad, I think 4 out of 5 tell me, well, we kind of don't. You just have to take my word for it. I've got the experience. I've got the 20 years of industry behind me. And the whole lean startup approach is about bringing in the data.
What if the Hippo is a client and they're basically like, well, we'll pay you, just build it, this is what we want. How do you say to them, no, actually you'll save more in the long run if you let us build this minimum piece and learn from it?
Well, it's interesting because we're also developing software at my company, and one of the teams has asked me just that. And the answer is, at first you don't. But then you try to gather the data and show it to them. That's what they did. So they tried to argue with the client, we're trying to save you money, we're trying to narrow down the feature set. And he goes, no, you don't understand, we really need it, and so on. And for, I think it was 6 or 9 months, they kept gathering some data, and then they organized this type of client retreat. For 2 days, they went with the client somewhere in the mountains, and they discussed and had beers and so on. And then they brought in the data. And at one point he said, oh guys, you care more about my money than I do. So, true story, by the way.
It's really quite important to engage them early. Innovation games is another way of bringing them in by a feature, you know, prune a tree, all that sort of stuff. Anybody's been used to that. Take one more question, then we're going to have lunch. Yes, at the back.
Sometimes if you're sort of working with, say, public bodies,
can you speak up a little bit? We can't hear you.
Sometimes when you're working with, say, public bodies, they talk about compliance. So when you try and take a lean approach and say, hey, we'll just deliver A, B, C, D, and that's enough, they'll go, no, it's compliance. And even though it's only used once, you still want it. And then you explain, it's...
Then you charge them for it.
Well,
Then you charge them for
no,
it.
but you've got timescales then. Yeah, and you might be trying to make a deadline, and they're making it difficult for you to make that deadline. How do you talk them around that? And they're not motivated by money.
Well, I've actually had this type of experience. I worked with a company that was developing software for our government. And, well, the short answer is, again, you don't, at first. So, these techniques are not universally applicable. There are contexts in which they are a lot easier to apply, especially if you're doing your own product development and so on. As you are adding all these types of complexities, like having the external client that you're developing for, or having the government as your client and so on, it becomes harder. But I will tell you a story even in that type of context. So, which is not necessarily related to this, but I was working with managers, with line managers, and we were installing, they were calling it Scrum. And they kept arguing with me that they really need to have the requirements document up front because those are the rules and you don't understand and so on. And we can't change that. And I was arguing against it. And at one point I went to the department director and I said, here's what your managers are telling me. Is there really no way to change that? And he said, well, sure there is. Because actually the contract with the requirements document, we created that ourselves. Why? Well, you know, because we get paid for the deliverables. You know, when we supply the requirements document, we get a certain chunk of money. So we could replace that. So, but this is all about organizational change, which is a different topic altogether.
Okay.
So, yeah, if you want, I invite you to go back to your pairs before you go to lunch and share one takeaway that might help you in the context you discussed earlier, or maybe some new insight that you had during this session, and that's about it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.